I'm Alex Tarrant for interest.co.nz, and we're here with the Finance Minister, Steven Joyce, a couple of weeks out before the election. This is the first of our series of interviews with some of the key finance people this election. We've got Grant Robertson and James Shaw as well lined up. So on a beautiful Wellington day, actually, it's a bit blustery but sunny. So thanks for joining us. I want to look back sort of over the 9 years at some point, but okay. I just want to start looking forward a bit, because in preview you mentioned a second families package, families income package, and you talked about low to middle income earners, and you talked about simplifying the tax system down there. Can you just let us know exactly a bit more what you exactly mean by that and what you'll be targeting?
Yeah, well, we're talking about it around 2020, which is on the numbers that we've got in front of us. That's the best. That's the sort of first best opportunity to do it. And the idea of a second family incomes package would be much like the first one. And probably the best way to explain it is a little bit more like the first one. So you'll want to look at tax thresholds, and as you know, I'm quite concerned about that middle income threshold, that it doesn't get too far behind the median income. It's still going to be behind the median income once we make the adjustment that we're making 1st of April next year. But then you get to what I'm talking about, the lower middle income end and lower income end, and successive governments historically have kept adding in more transfers rather than adjusting tax rates at that end. And I think the trouble with that is you end up with people getting very confused as to what their entitlements are and what happens to their entitlements if they make changes in their lives. And that can get people stuck in the same place. So if somebody goes out and does another 5 hours a week work, or somebody gets a second job, or somebody changes their job if they're in the lower income area, what does that mean in terms of their accommodation supplement, they're working for families, or independent in a tax credit? And so are we talking about like abatement rates, changing them or getting rid of them, or are we talking about a tax-free threshold at the bottom to make everything just a whole lot more simple? Well, I'm not sure about the idea of a tax-free threshold. I just think that we're going to be looking at potentially just driving more of the positive changes through the tax system, and less of it through the transfer system. Now, I haven't designed it yet, and we're not in a position to design it, but you saw this time we took out the independent earner tax credit from 1 April next year, and we said let's put that through the tax system instead, so that everybody gets it. I mean, that's a ridiculous situation where a whole bunch of people don't even get it because they don't even know they're entitled to it. They might get it later on. That's just one example, but there are other examples where you'd say, well, we'd rather actually showing people more of the value of their work. So yeah, potentially lowering the effective marginal tax rates of people's wages at the lower end, rather than doing more in the transfer space.
And you've spoken about thresholds and that middle income threshold. Is this when we might see legislation to shift thresholds sort of, I don't know, every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, in line with CPI inflation?
I haven't really thought that through. I mean, I think it's an interesting idea, but it's no more than that. I think the difficulty is that assumes that the economy is constantly moving in the right direction. But I think the alternative is that actually governments regularly update those thresholds. And I think we're the first government to do that for quite a while. Labor, of course, are saying let's not even do it now, and I think that they think that shifting those thresholds are anathema. But sooner or later, then everybody's going to end up on paying 30 cents in the dollar tax if we're not careful.
Okay. Now you've talked about low to middle income earners mostly. Does that mean high income earners are effectively going to miss out? Because I think the last families package in budget 2017, I think Bill Rosenberg wrote 36% of the benefits went to the top 20% of earners. So
I think there's some interesting maths going on there, to be honest. But
you agree
not just
with top earners.
Well, we'll get something through the threshold changes, but I'm certainly not focused on that top tax threshold. I'm focused much more on the lower and middle threshold, and I think we need to keep doing that to ensure that there's that opportunity for low and middle income earners.
Okay, so we're talking about shifting thresholds, tax cuts. Is this the best way you think to get more money in people's pockets?
Well, I think ideally yes, because actually you want to link their income more directly to their work, which is what I was talking about with these transfers. If people can see the benefit of an extra hour's work or changing jobs to a higher income more easily than they can in lower and middle income jobs, where you've got to get your tax table out and your working for families table and your accommodation supplement table and think about what it all means and then decide, should I actually do something or should I just stay where I am because I'm worried about losing all this stuff, then I think that would be better for New Zealand economically. It would be better for people to see, you know, the true fruits of their work rather than having it all completely de-linked.
Yep, because another way to help income in people's pockets is to improve productivity of businesses. Business productivity improves, margins improve, and they can pay higher wages. It's been a bit of a debate in New Zealand recently on our productivity scenarios. What are your thoughts on how labour productivity is tracked under your term in government?
Well, it's actually tracked better than most other developed countries at the moment. We're having this debate about that, but if you look at GDP per hours worked, it's gone better. Nobody's arguing it's stellar. New Zealand has had a long-term productivity problem, and since the GFC, the world has had a productivity growth problem. So what we're really saying is in a bunch of quite sort of short countries in terms of productivity improvement, we happen to be one of the taller ones, and that's what's happening right now. But I think, you know, the seeds of productivity growth are pretty obvious. One is because productivity growth is driven ultimately by companies. You know, so a government or a minister can say, "Oh, I want to grow productivity," but you know, with the greatest respect to anybody that says that, that's driven by individual organisations, individual companies improving their productivity. So let's deal with it at a company level. How do I improve my productivity? Well, I can invest in capital equipment. That means that we get more out of every hour of work. I can have the confidence to invest in new markets. So with the existing structure that I have, the existing organisation, I can sell more, so that makes me more efficient and delivers more productivity. And perhaps I can organise myself better. So that brings you to things like ultra-fast broadband and the internet connectivity. So maybe I don't have to travel as much. Maybe my staff can do things more without actually having to. So all of those things are what's important. So I'd say coming back for us, that is your investment in broadband and in other infrastructure. That is your investment in market access, growing market access. And importantly, it's the confidence of businesses to invest. Okay. That's important.
I'll put you that though, the gross capital formation since you've come into power, so as a percentage of GDP, I've just looked at a few figures, it was 25% of GDP, gross capital formation in 2008, and it's 24% now. Business investment, looking at the expenditure measure of GDP, that stayed flat at 18%.
Business investment's gone up, and then it came back, and then it's gone up again in recent times.
Okay, but it's still it's pretty much as where you guys found it. And just moving on productivity, one of the major criticisms being flung about at the moment by a particular ex-Reserve Bank economist, Michael Riddell, is that
Riddell's appeared.
Productivity basically in the second half of your term has done worse than in the first half of the term.
Well, I think that's true, but that's also true for most countries, actually.
Okay, but you accept that?
All I'm saying is that productivity has been a struggle everywhere. If you look across the 8 years, and let's be careful, these people that talk about productivity measures over a year are really, they're really.
Well, you're talking sort of 5 years.
Yeah, well, 5 years is getting more like it. Certainly, because the thing about measuring productivity is that it's generally measured more effectively a couple of years after the fact, which is very frustrating for those of us that are focused on it. Sure. It's also got to be measured over a longer period of time. So you had, for example, the increase in hours worked measured by the changes to the household labour force survey last year, and that just threw out everybody's productivity measures, and some of that was a statistical change in effect. But the thing about what's going on now, and Catherine Mann from the OECD was good about, she was very interesting on this subject when she came here, because people said to her, "What about productivity?" And she said, well, look, you're in a situation where the capacity of your labour market is growing quickly, you're bringing more people into work. Over time, if you maintain that, you've effectively built the capacity of your economy. It's hard to build your capacity and your productivity at exactly the same time. Once you've built your capacity, you'll go through a stage of improving the productivity as the businesses invest in more capital. She was not remotely worried from an OECD point of view that, say, the last 2 or 3 years, because of the significant labour market growth, was not necessarily leading to fast productivity growth. Her sense was that would come.
So it is, though, linked to labour market growth and immigration, record immigration, that productivity is lagged behind. So I think under Riddell showing, under national 1990 to 99, we had labour productivity growth of 11%, the next Labour government nearly 10%, his measures have you on about 5%, but the last 5 years -1%.
Well, it depends on what you're measuring, and that comes to the other problem.
Do we have to cut off, though, immigration? Do we have to cut off increasing the workforce slightly, maybe, in order to see that come through?
So we say to all our companies, sorry, you can't have any more staff. You'll just have to somehow grow with the existing staff you've got. And for some, that's possible. But let's think that through. So if I'm Rod Jury at Xero, for example, I can build my waitlist business anywhere. I want to hire another 150 software engineers, and you say I can't bring them into New Zealand. I want experienced ones. I'm prepared to hire some graduates, but I want some experienced ones. And so that's fine. I just have to set up an office in Sydney. So Michael would achieve what he aimed, except that then you shift that production offshore. And that's the challenges you face, because capital is portable, and skills are portable, particularly as you get into these more weightless exports, which we want to be excited about and we want to see more of in this country. So that has to be very carefully. That's just not. I just don't think that that's possible to do. But again, I come back to the point about you do need to lift the capacity of your economy as well, and I have to also come back to his measures of productivity, because the OECD GDP per hour worked measure says that, which is actually a very important measure of productivity. And I appreciate there's dueling measures. That says
the Stats NZ ones are.
If you just go and have
now,
if you go look at the OECD comparators, and I know I've seen his critique of all of that.
So he says they tweak them before putting it through, and he's tried to.
But if you want to do international comparisons and time frame comparisons, they do run them all on the same basis. They don't suddenly do big changes. Compared to our 8 years with the previous 8 years, that's in the books at the moment, New Zealand's productivity growth has been faster. But again, I don't want to get into a massive debate about it, because there's always more to do, and productivity is one of those sort of 30 or 40 year New Zealand issues, which we're only just starting to see improve. But I think it's the consistency of economic policy which encourages the investment.
Okay, I want to get on to wage growth. And
sure.
It's something that actually has been maybe stronger than what some people might think, given the headlines.
That's right.
On wage growth. But I mean, we've had since you came into office, we've had GDP grow about 20%, well 18%, wages about 20%. So that's over that time period. But then, if you look to sort of from the second term onwards, it's GDP growth of 14%, wages of 12%. So wage growth. This is me looking at the QES.
Sure. Okay.
Hourly private sector wages. So wage growth has actually sort of dipped below GDP growth, and then over the last term, that's the same thing. So it effectively feels like we're working harder to produce more output, but wage earners aren't sort of sharing in the prosperity at relative rates.
Well, firstly, are you doing real wage increases, or are you doing nominal?
Nominal markers. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's your first issue, because inflation, particularly last year, was pretty much nil. I'm trying to remember exactly when it was that it was nil. We had a 12-month period where it was zero. So you've got.
We've still got wage growth. We've still got wage growth at lower rates than overall GDP growth.
Yes, but if you're doing a direct comparator and you're not pulling out your nominal, you're not doing real wage growth versus real GDP.
Well, that would be even less then.
Well, it would be less potentially, but the point is that it's also what's important is what you can purchase with those wages. So my point is that the measure that people are most interested in is how is their purchasing power growing from their wages, and on that measure we've been growing at roughly twice the rate of inflation. And in terms of, again, take a longer term period as you did to start with, which I think you have to do in these things, because you can end up, particularly when you've got in a low inflationary environment, you can end up some quite small changes being magnified over a shorter period. That were looking bigger over a shorter period. You'd have to say that it's kept pace over that period. And in fact, if you look at the Perry report, he thinks that in terms of overall income equality, income inequality, and the share of income across all the decile groups, that New Zealand has actually stayed pretty steady over that period.
I think he says that after housing costs, it looks a bit rough.
Well, again, it depends on the measure you use, but one of the things we want to do with that family incomes package, of course, is to help people with high housing costs, because there's no doubt that with the big high asset prices internationally, right across the world, we've ended up with some high housing costs, and that's why the accommodation supplement is so important for low-income families.
Is it worrying though that, and I accept the purchasing power argument, but is it worrying though that wage growth seems to be growing less than the general economy?
Well, I'd have to go back and
income earners aren't.
I'm not taking you on face value with that. Well, even though you've got a great sheaf of papers there, I'm not taking you on face value. I'd have to go back and have a look at that.
All right.
But I think the reality is that there's not a major. It's not like some parts of the world where you've seen an income redistribution to a particular part of society. That's definitely not occurred here, and Perry has made that clear.
Okay. I want to change tack a little bit to housing. So.
Yep.
The CPI, since you've come into power, CPI inflation has been up about 14.5%. House price inflation has been up 67%, house value inflation, those QB stats. What are your thoughts on that when you're given those two numbers?
Well, it's asset prices right around, actually. I don't know what you'd do if you went and looked at the NZX over that period. The problem we've all got, which we're all grappling with, is that we have we had the GFC, then we had reserve banks or central banks around the world effectively getting themselves into a deep hole, and then they've ended up printing a lot of money, quantitative easing, zero real interest rates, and New Zealand's part of the world, but that's led to big asset price inflation. So low returns, high asset price inflation, and that's been reflected everywhere. And New Zealand's been caught up in that. So right around the world, we've got high asset prices and low interest rates. So that's fine for people that have already got to the stage of life when they own their assets. It's fine for those people in some ways that are perhaps borrowed against assets, because including houses, they've got low interest rates.
Yeah.
But then it's hard. The hard part is for people starting out, because their deposit, particularly to purchase a house, is higher compared to incomes. I think that's where the real pressure comes. And that's why we've done this KiwiSaver Home Start program and other things you wouldn't normally do.
Is it disappointing though that you're having to turn to government subsidies for first home buyers over this? Because
yes, it is. Yes, it is. Of course, that's the case. But the reason for that is, as I say, is this whole international phenomenon that we're dealing with.
So,
and we're part of the world. I mean, we don't get a choice.
Cash is coming in and pushing up our
well,
prices.
Not just so much that is that right around the world, you've got very low interest rates, and New Zealand's interest rates are driven as much by international inflation, or lack of it, as they are by domestic inflation. Now, tradables inflation has been flat to negative for a long time, and so we have that transmitted into us. And if people are getting, people depositors and so on are getting low interest rates, people go looking for yield, and asset prices gets pushed up. But the other problem, of course, is the issue of house construction. And we could get into that, because the two of them work together, or working in a way that's not necessarily great for first home buyers at all. And the challenge there is we just haven't built enough houses historically. And as much as we make that a political debate, the real problem was between about 2003 and 2009 in Auckland, where the numbers of houses and sections available just dropped and dropped and dropped, to the point where Auckland was building in 2009 2,500 houses a year, which is a ridiculously small amount for a city of that size. Now that's built up since then. We're now
10,000, but it looks like we're going back down.
Well, I think, and this is one of the interesting challenges of demand side management versus supply management. We can get into that, but the point is that it's now back up to a level which looks like it's going to continue for a period of time, according to the construction reports that are put out independently by brands and those guys.
Which came in below expectations the last time around.
Well, it did a little bit, but assuming that they've got it broadly right, and we can debate a little bit where the margin is, but then actually we're going to see that fixed over time, and again, provided, ironically, if we allow ourselves the capacity of bringing in builders and so on from overseas to keep growing New Zealand. I mean, New Zealand is a reasonably small country, so we can sort of restrict the size of our economy by building a wall around it and saying we're not prepared to bring in any other skills. Although if you stand back and look at it from offshore, they'd say, so New Zealand, you're doing quite well, and you're actually going to handicap yourself through this period. For what reason?
Yep.
So that's one of the reasons.
I accept the debate about bringing people in. So I've been spending the morning reading through monetary policy statements.
Good for you.
Of the last 10 years, which has been great fun. Yeah. So in 2009, the Reserve Bank had started talking about the risks linked between rising immigration rates and the housing market. We went flat for a couple of years. Then in 2013, though, they started again talking about differences in supply and demand in the housing market. We've had the warnings there for years.
If you look at
the criticism is that you did start the latest round of sort of policy initiatives too late.
Well,
to increase house building.
Well, actually, those policy initiatives have now been happening since that period, since it became clear that there was an emerging issue. I think what everybody would say.
You don't think you moved too late?
No, I think what everybody would say is that it's been harder to push some of the regulatory levers in terms of getting the impact than we would like. I mean, so for example, the Auckland Unitary Plan, we actually accelerated it beyond what's ever been possible before, actually passed a law to make it so, which brings me to urban planning reform, which we can get to in a minute. But those things, they all take a period of time, and I think that's been frustrating for everybody.
Did you expect you could do it quicker when you started off, when you established the Productivity Commission?
Well, if you look at the growth that's occurred over that period, is actually we've had the fastest compound growth in the New Zealand construction sector for some years.
But you've had 67% rise in house prices as well.
Well, but you can't. You asked me, is the construction sector growing quickly? And the answer is, it is growing really quickly.
Is it growing quick enough?
Well, you can debate that, but actually, you are growing as faster than we've ever grown before off a low base, and so it's hard to turn around and say, oh, well, we could just magically turn it. It's the same with when we did the Christchurch rebuild. We knew that there would have to be a certain number of people working in the sector within a couple of years. That actually came to pass, but it doesn't happen overnight. You can't just sort of say, okay, we go from this many to double that in a 3 months period. It's just not possible.
Okay, just sticking on house prices, we're nearly there. Since the 2014 election, if you look at the house price index, it's up about 27%. So someone who owns a house worth $600,000 then, it's now worth over $750,000. So it's $150,000 over 3 years. So if they were to sell it now, it was their home, so they wouldn't be caught by the bright line test.
Yeah.
For someone earning $50,000 a year at an effective tax rate of 16%, they're paying that tax rate on their $50,000 a year.
That's
which
right.
Gross would be $150,000 a year. Is it fair though that person who's just sold that house for $150,000 more than they bought it for has to pay tax?
They'll have to go and buy another one.
Yeah.
In that current market.
Yeah.
So yes, it sounds good, but actually they're going to have to move back into that market unless they're completely cashing out. That's what they're going to have to do. So there's a limit to that. There's a limit to that comparison in that everybody's in that situation, and most people, when you buy and sell a house, you don't actually walk off with it.
Though. What if they're leaving the country? What if they're downsizing? What if they're?
Then we're getting into some specific exceptions, but actually most people, when they buy and sell a house, and don't ask me for a percentage, but most people who move out of a house buy another one, and they're dealing in the market that you have there today. Now, I'm not arguing for that sort of ongoing price increases. I'm arguing that actually if we have enough growth in the housing market around the country in terms of supply, as we've seen in Christchurch, then actually house price growth stops. And actually in Auckland now, you are seeing house price growth has been flat. In fact, it's been falling for the last 12 months. Not many people talk about it. It's a couple of % off over the last 12 months in terms of the median price.
I think it has to either keep falling quite a bit, or wages, or it has to stay flat.
Well,
for 20 to 30 years before.
Well, I don't know about that many years, but again, I'm not sure that's right. But and the other affordability measure that's in the elephant in the room is interest rates. Which is why I always say to people, be careful, because interest rates at some point will go up again. And if you want to get, this is one of the...
That's more for people in existing housing, though, isn't it?
No, it's for everybody. I mean, the reality is, one of the biggest drivers of, say, house price to income ratio is interest rates. And when people talk about, I'd love to get the house price to income ratio back to 4, well, the last time it was at 4, interest rates were at 18%. So there's no free lunch in all of this. I actually want us just to keep building more houses and allowing more onto the market, which will ensure in places like Auckland that house prices stay at a fairly steady level for an extended period of time. and then we can get that balance. And the idea is that that happens at a time when interest rates remain low. Otherwise, people will get caught with higher mortgages.
Just back to my example quickly. So the argument of not comparing the wage income with the asset income, the capital gain income, is that effectively you'd put us to that person has to go and buy another house.
Well, that's one argument.
So
the wider argument about
you
asset
don't
valuations.
treating it as both as income.
No, I don't. Yeah, no, I don't agree with that. It's not in New Zealand's. Not in the way we've actually run society in New Zealand for a very long time.
Sure. Another way of evening out the housing market is the Andrew Coleman idea of instead of whacking capital gains tax or imputed rents onto housing, is taking taxes off savings. So perhaps sanctioned savings schemes, perhaps by way of any money that's put into a sanctioned savings scheme straight out of the income isn't taxed initially. Is that something that appeals to you?
Well, I wouldn't actually comment on his particular proposal because I haven't looked at it in enough detail, but I am interested in looking at the taxation on savings at some point. And
next term?
Yes, I'd like to have a chance to have a look at it in the next term. I think that's an area of work that New Zealand needs to do. If we want to encourage more savings, we can either say the government should subsidise savings more, which I'm less inclined.
Well, you're kind of doing that with KiwiSaver.
But that's right.
Yeah.
And so the question then is are we putting anything in the way of encouraging people to save by, for example, the effective tax rates and so on?
So are we talking about compulsory KiwiSaver and changing the tax rates?
No, I'm not keen on compulsory KiwiSaver. I'm keen to encourage everybody into it or into a similar scheme. But what I'm not interested in is making it compulsory, because there's for plenty of people at different stages of their lives, it's not necessarily the best thing for them to do. So if they've just started a business and it's going to be a successful business, then they could make a strong argument their money should go into their business at that time. Why should it go into a KiwiSaver scheme? Similarly, you can make the argument that some people it would be more preferable to pay off their mortgage, or some of their mortgage. And allowing sufficient flexibility for people to do that, I think, is actually just treating everybody like grown-ups.
But we could see some changes to the savings regime, savings tax.
Oh, you might be overstating it. I'm just saying I wouldn't mind looking at it. I've said that publicly before.
Okay, a couple of numbers just to finish. One of the big goals set by this government was exports to GDP.
Yeah, 2025, that's right.
2025, you've still got a few years.
That's right.
When you came in, it was 29%. This year, it's 29%. Are you disappointed?
Oh, I'd like to see more growth than that, but you have to go and look at what's been happening under the hood. And under the hood, world trade intensity has dropped. So if you look at New Zealand relative to, say, your Singapores, your Denmarks or so on, which are the big traders, they've gone back a bit because we've had an extended period of a decline in world trade. So we've held our own. Again, that's nothing to write home about necessarily, except that we haven't slipped back the way other countries have. And the other thing, of course, we've been dealing with is our biggest exports been down a bit of a hole over the last 2 or 3 years. What I think is exciting is that we had all these doomsayers coming out and saying, oh my goodness, the dairy price has dropped, that'll be the end of New Zealand for 3 years. And what we've shown is that we've diversified sufficiently into other industries at this point, more to do, but with
tourism, ICT.
Education, ICT, the other food sectors, that actually we were able to maintain and grow our value of exports compared to when dairy was 23-24% at one stage of the export pie. So I think that's been good to see that maturity grow, and I think as dairy comes back on stream, we'll see that proportion lift as well as the overall number lift. But we've got a job on to get to 40%. Still got the goal.
All right, imports as well. Final one. Imports as a percentage of GDP, 30% 2008, 33% now. You worried that we're?
No, I'm not too worried about that. The key thing in the New Zealand context, in fact, any country, is how much debt you're creating, what's your liabilities to the rest of the world, and New Zealand has come down from 84% of GDP, I think, to about 58.5%. Sure.
You'd like to see that keep going?
I'd like to see that keep going.
Target?
Well, no, I'm not going to put a target on it, but it's worked better with that one. But the Treasury keep predicting it'll go up again, and I keep having a little side bet with them that actually I think it's going to keep coming down.
Well, they keep saying that the current account deficit is going to keep going
up.
Oh,
that's been one of my favourite contests with the Treasury. In the time that I've been Associate Minister of Finance, they have been predicting it to return to but not so much these days. They used to say over 6%. I kept telling them they were wrong, and what was happening under the hood in the New Zealand export sector was encouraging. They've given up now after I've won a couple of bottles of nice orange juice or the equivalent on that, and I actually think New Zealand's external sector is showing pretty good resilience, and what we've proven to Treasury is this is not necessarily the case that we always revert to type, provided you run the economy well and you encourage these export-facing businesses to get out there and trade.
And I'll give it to you that terms of trade are at a 40-year high again.
That's right. Something's going right.
So next 3 years, what can we expect if you're back in?
Well, it's a number of things. Firstly, we're very, very keen on encouraging the opening up of markets and this whole facing the world. Making sure that New Zealand does best foot forward on the world stage. We'd love to get TPP 11 over the line. That's not just totally dependent on us, but I just see this massive opportunity for New Zealand, which I'm excited about for New Zealand companies, is that we can get out there and give them a platform that makes them hugely competitive on the world stage. That's what we're doing. I think we can double down on all of that, the innovation side, the trade side, and so on. And that will actually ensure that New Zealand really gets the benefits out of a growing Asia-Pacific region, and particularly the Asian economies. Now, that's our vision. The alternative is, I have to say, one that doesn't understand businesses, because it's proposing to put on a whole lot more taxes and reduce the competitiveness of New Zealand in the world economy. And I think that would be very negative for this country over the next 3 years.
We'll see what Grant Robertson has to say about that.
I'm sure you will.
Well, thank you very much, Finance Minister. That was Finance Minister Steven Joyce, 2 weeks out from an election. I'm Alex Tarrant from interest.co.nz.